Hi, I'm Deborah Compton, and welcome to my presentation. The objective of this presentation are to first share background information on asbestos, the historical and current uses of asbestos-containing materials, and the hazards of asbestos exposure. Second, to give a summary of a study that describes measures that can prevent the spread of asbestos fibers during the destruction of structures containing asbestos materials. And finally, a discussion and demonstration on how to use the asbestos study as an instructional reference and engage during an IB chemistry unit on experimental design and data analysis. Asbestos is a term that describes minerals that have a fibrous structure. They are separated into two categories or families: the amphiboles family, which consists of 5 different minerals, and the serpentine family, which consists of only chrysotile, which is also known as white asbestos. 90 to 95% of all asbestos used is in the form of chrysotile, with some limited use of the amphiboles in the form of ammiocyte and chrysotile. History shows asbestos use going back thousands of years, and modern era uses started in the early 1900s. Its property of high tensile strength and resistance to heat and corrosion made it a perfect substance for use in construction materials as well as automotive and marine parts. Asbestosis is caused by the scarring of lung tissues by asbestos fibers. The scarring causes shortness of breath and can lead to mesothelioma, an aggressive lung cancer. Workers and those exposed to the secondhand dust have a marked increase in these and other cancers. Due to the health risks, asbestos use was stopped in many products worldwide in the early 2000s. Many countries have banned the use and production of asbestos-containing materials. Although the use is limited in the United States, it is not banned completely, and is also an issue in lower socioeconomic countries. The scene of a large dust plume rising from the Twin Towers on 9/11 are images of a day that we will never forget. As dust-covered faces ran through the streets, they did not realize that the thick dust was also something to fear. The plumes contain an estimated 5,000 tons of asbestos. The human exposure was up to 1,000 times more than just a typical asbestos abasement process. The exposure leads to instant respiratory distress and later could develop into asbestosis or mesothelioma or other deadly diseases. The goal of the study, quantifying asbestos fibers in post-disaster situations, is to determine the best method for the suppression of asbestos dust that occurs as a result of building collapse. When a building with asbestos-containing materials, or ACMs, collapses, it scatters fibers and puts anyone exposed at risk of respiratory damage and disease. Although research exists on dust control techniques, the studies on asbestos fibers do not go far enough. Determining concentration of asbestos dust due to scattering and the contaminant and the containment of that dust is the focus of this study. As building materials, ACMs are found both indoors in ceiling finishes and floor tiles, and outdoors in roofing materials. During a disaster, quick control is essential. Using asbestos stabilizers prevent the scattering of the fibers during damage by embedding them with adhesives. Simply spraying them with water may also impede dust formation. An experiment was conducted using asbestos-containing roofing tiles called ACRs. The ACRs of the same size were either coated with asbestos stabilizer, water, or not coated at all to be used as a control. The tiles were placed in a chamber, and when damaged, a 900-liter sample of air was collected and analyzed. The concentration of asbestos fibers in the samples was determined using a phase contrast contrast microscope. The result of the experiment showed the uncoated ACR air sample had a concentration far above the acceptable limit of 0.01 fibers per cc, even after 36 hours. The air sample collected from the tile coated with water had a concentration well below the acceptable limit in the first 3 hours, but had a sharp rise well past the limit after 36 hours. The air sample from the stabilizer-coated tile started out well below the limit, and although it trended slightly up, it remained lower than the acceptable limit. These results suggest that in a disaster, the use of water would prevent the initial scattering of particles, with a follow-up of the stabilizer to protect during the cleanup, disposal, and the restoration process. Now, this study can be used to help IB baccalaureate chemistry students, because as a part of their studies, they are required to complete an investigation. Their report requires the application of an experimental design, data collection, and error analysis, and the research methods and the methods used in this quantifying asbestos study could be used as an exemplar or possible introduction to an IB chemistry unit on experimental design. Having students generate questions creates engagement in the learning experience. And this quote, "There is no learning without having to pose a question," by Richard Feynman, really emphasizes this thought. The question formulation technique, or the QFT, is a process that guides students and even colleagues through a question generation process. The process stimulates divergent, convergent, and metacognitive thinking. It starts by presenting a question, or what's called a Q focus. This can be a statement, a video, a discrepant event, a phenomenon, or in this case, a research study. It's just never a question. Participants are given the rules and a time limit and then told to start. In this case, they are guided to read through the study and generate questions based on the experimental design and its relationship to the IB research requirements. It does have rules, and these are that they can ask, that you are to ask as many questions as you can in the time limit. You do not stop to answer, judge, or discuss the questions. You write down every question exactly as stated, and you change any statements into questions. This is a list of possible questions students might generate. Remind students to say anything that comes to mind, and you will notice the questions become more thoughtful as the process continues. Also, direct the recorder to number the questions. Once the questions are generated, participants are asked to label the questions as either opened or closed. This process has them analyze the questions they have generated using divergent and convergent thinking. Often the questions are closed-ended, and it results in dead-end research. Revising questions open up the research possibilities. And so they're asked to just take one closed-ended question and turn it into an open-ended, and then an open-ended and turn it into a closed-ended. Again, practicing that divergent and convergent thinking. Finally, a question or two is chosen to pursue. The process could lead to their personal research question for the IB project, or identify areas where more study is needed to proceed. The question formulation technique provides a motivation for students to learn as they are seeking answers to their own questions rather than those posed by a teacher. Now that we've seen the next steps of the question formulation technique, there might be some information that students need to gather. And one way to do that is through the Process-Oriented Guided Inquiry process, or POGIL. It is a method of active learning where students work in teams through a specially designed activity that requires them to explore, make meaning, and then apply concepts. The team members are given specific roles such as facilitator and recorder. The teacher acts as the facilitator of the process. POGILs can provide teaching for needed content that was identified during the next steps of the question formulation technique. This is an example of a POGIL that would be applicable for this situation. The experimental design POGIL will help students with the process of identifying variables and setting up control groups. You can see that in this POGIL, they start off with a model, and in that model, students evaluate and create meaning and answer questions that will scaffold into some basics and then into deep thinking. The data analysis POGIL will teach students how to organize data and choose the best methods to use during their research. Using an interesting topic to engage and motivate students to develop their own questions is key to sustainable learning. Providing access to student-centered learning opportunities that provide needed content and skills that students are seeking to answer their research questions looks more like doing science than doing busy work. I am planning on using this activity in my classroom this fall and have high hopes that the overall results will be amazing IB investigations. It was a pleasure sharing my presentation with you. Thank you.